Hello and welcome to Mindscapes, our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is truly a Renaissance man. He studied philosophy at Harvard, only to return to business school there. He was head of Procter & Gamble for several years, has authored at least 3 plays which have been performed off-Broadway and at the famous Edinburgh festivals in the United Kingdom. He's authored most recently, India Unbound. I'm delighted to welcome Gurcharan Das. Gurcharan, India Unbound, and you say in that The Economist has been trying to paint India with stripes since 1991 when the reforms really happened in a sense. And India is more really like the elephant is the analogy that you use. Why not the tiger? Why the elephant?
Well, I think for several reasons. But the primary one is the fact that democracy preceded capitalism in India.
Why is that significant?
And in fact, there are only 2 societies in the world where this happened. Everywhere, it was the other way around. It was the United States and India. The US got democracy in 1776, and they got capitalism in the early 19th century when industrial revolution took place. In India, we got democracy in 1950, and we began our affair with capitalism in 1991. So this inversion, this historic inversion, explains a lot about India. And it means that our path to the future is a much more negotiated path. It means that we have to contend. Every policy has to contend with the Nehruvian, old leftist Nehruvian forces which are still alive. It means we have to contend with the Gandhian forces. It means that we have to contend with the village and the caste. And it means we have to contend with the global forces of capitalism, modern forces.
What is this relationship?
That slows us down.
Okay, I'm not yet clear. What is this relationship between the fact that democracy preceded capitalism? Why? What is this relationship, this connection?
Well, I'm not sure, really, what is the relationship. But I do know that as a result of democracy, we have liberated the lower castes. They've come up. And that gives people confidence. There's a lot more confidence in the country. And then after 91, there's a mindset change, especially among young people. I mean, I don't think Manmohan Singh realized what he was doing in the North Bloc. He thought he was doing some structural adjustments, but actually he was changing the mindset of the country. So you have these forces unleashed, the forces of entrepreneurship. You have this can-do attitude. Money is no longer a bad word. All the sons of the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas want to get MBAs and become banyas, start .com companies. So there is a huge change that's going on. But it's change going on within democracy. And this 50 years of democracy was a school. We went to this school, we loved the school, we were already a contentious people. So, if anything, we've become even more contentious.
So what was the learning from the school?
Well, I think the learning from the school is, first of all, that I just don't think we'll ever go back to ever being an autocratic society. Now, that's a very strong word, but I don't think anybody will suggest that we get frustrated by the pace of reform, etc. The other thing, of course, is that it slows us down. I mean, it does make a difference, and that's why we're not a tiger.
In what ways are we the elephant?
Well, we are an elephant which has, in fact, lumbered. It's begun to move, and we may not have speed of a tiger, but we have the distance. We have stamina. And as we look to the future, I think that maybe this, being an elephant, if we can avoid some of the pitfalls of an unprepared capitalist society like Russia, or an autocratic society like China, I think we have a greater chance of preserving our culture, particularly given the strength of our traditions. We are, after all, probably one of the most traditional societies on the earth, the hold of religion, the hold and so on. So if all this happens, I think maybe we are a wise elephant.
But you know, given the sort of the interface, in a sense, between the new economies, the new sort of styles, techniques, and structures of economics, the sort of the very intimate interface between culture and that process of speed, of technology, of being quick to respond. In what ways, and you mentioned about, you talked about culture, in what ways will that interface with our traditional culture? How will it impact each other?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, generally, I am not a believer of overemphasizing culture. I think, frankly, people around the world are more similar than they are dissimilar. And therefore, economic forces have a greater role to play in outcomes than cultural forces. But nevertheless, I mean, economists do not pay attention sufficiently to some of the things that are different. And the things that are different, culture is the thing that explains, for example, why we failed, partly explains, why we have failed to create an industrial revolution. And there, I think it goes back to our Brahminical contempt for working with our hands. Industrial revolutions are made by tinkerers. And that means a tinkerer is one who combines knowledge with working with his hands, combines curiosity with hands. Working with hands was always the job of a Shudra in India, and knowledge was denied to the Shudra. So therefore, our Banyas inherited this, and that's one of the difficulties of Indian companies in trying to be competitive today, that they, if you ask an Indian businessman, you know, about his product, he can't tell you how it works. Now, a Japanese businessman is obsessed with his product. He thinks about it day and night and how he's going to improve it. But the same Brahminical heritage now in the knowledge economy is going to come to our advantage. So my view is, actually, we're going to skip the Industrial Revolution. But we shouldn't get too depressed about it. We're going to go straight from the agriculture or green revolution to the knowledge revolution. And there, this seems to play to our advantage, because that same Brahminical heritage has made us into an abstract people. And we've had 3,000 years of experience and experience of working with the abstract. And so in some ways, just as spiritual space is invisible, so is cyberspace. And so maybe, now this is a hypothesis, and I'm not sure if this can even ever be proved, but there's the fact that we are showing some robust competitiveness in software and in generic pharmaceuticals, in entertainment, is a sign that this the sort of non-manual culture is going to play to our advantage.
But isn't that very utopian? I mean, while we are graduating 2 million people a year, there are, you know, that many hundreds of million people who are not being educated, who are not getting a primary education.
Yeah, but you know, you're right. I mean, certainly it's not going to happen overnight. But the demonstration effect of education has already become so powerful. You see these kids, the learning that's going on in the bazaar, the success rate of NIITs and these kind of companies is pushing people into, because our own education system is not responding. So my own view is that Indians will become computer literate before they become blackboard literate. That we'll have computers, but we may not have blackboards in our schools. I mean, just the fact is that you have a situation where, for the first time, the 2 million people don't all have English. There are varied levels of English skills, but some levels. Now, the fact is, even a small level of English skills is far better than what most other countries have. So here our half-baked graduates have a chance in the future. And so really the best thing we can do for our society is what Amartya Sen keeps saying, educate our people, educate. And the wonderful thing, Rajiv, is that this demand for education is so strong from below that we're going to be surprised when the next census comes out. In 2001, we're going to discover that that 52% literacy rate from 91 is going to jump over 70. You know, already there are indications that it's gone up to about 63%.
The buzzword, the phrase, reforms, become sort of almost a cliche for a whole range of a kind of package of initiatives and changes and decontrol, disinvestment, etc., that we haven't completely understood. What do we mean by reform?
Exactly. Exactly. At one level, certainly, reform is just the process of removing the state from the economic sphere, which does not belong to it. But at another level, it is also the need, for example, to invest in education, to invest in health, which is we normally do not think. But that is the empowering reform, because you're empowering entrepreneurs through one set of reforms. But on the other hand, you need also to empower people through education. You need to empower farmers by having reform of agriculture, by allowing trade. We don't have free trade. A farmer can grow his crop and cry because he cannot ship his goods where he wants to, where there's a demand for it. So I think it's to catch one word, to try to come to grips with one word that defines reform is, if you think about it, liberalization is really liberation. Is liberation not from our foreign masters, but liberation from our own homegrown masters. Liberation from the state. Liberating the individual through education, liberating the forces of the economic forces in society from the tentacles of the bureaucrats and the politicians.
Isn't it ironical that Manmohan Singh's own party feels that it is time to reassess whether the reforms or liberalization or globalization or whatever phrase we choose to use for that isn't necessarily going down well with the people?
The fact that Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh lost a great opportunity to educate their own party. I mean, the first people that Manmohan Singh, all those wonderful forums, Manmohan Singh became the icon of around the world of reform. But what he failed to do was to educate his own party, convert his own party to this new path. And until Congress comes out and says loudly and clearly that, look, that old path of Nehruvian socialism is now dead, is wrong. Maybe it had a place at one time. I think Congress is not going to get to the first stage of sanity.
Is it sort of moving beyond the sort of context of the party? And I was really using that to suggest that perhaps there is a growing reservoir of opinion, of concern amongst vote banks that says that maybe this hasn't impacted us sufficiently. The cream is growing thicker at the top, and are we going to be left behind? Because until we begin to see better roads, until we begin to see more schools, sanitation, water, health, it doesn't matter that liberalization is taking place.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I mean, you're absolutely right that there has been. I was only illustrating that if Congress, not only did they, first the job they had to do was to educate their party, but then to educate the electorate. And I think if they had done that and stood tall in the election of 1995, they would have won. They did not. They reformed through stealth. They did not stand tall. They did not. You know, there have been reforms in democracies. It's not just Deng who did it, but Thatcher did it. Rawlings, Keating, Menem, Václav Havel, all these people have reformed in democracies. But one of the key things they did was they stood tall and they said, look, this is the right way. Now, I don't know what it will take for people to say this is the right way. But certainly one of the things you have said points to the way. That if we just, as we reform, supposing we do just what Digvijay Singh did, let us spend money creating schools and reforming schools, making sure the teachers show up. Put the brightest and best civil servants in the education bureaucracy, or devolve powers so that the teachers are now responsible to the parents in panchayats, in gram shiksha samitis, in municipalities, in neighborhoods. And if we do those kinds of things simultaneously, maybe we'll take some of the sting out of this, this sort of...
Because you've also said in your book that this is more a crisis perhaps of management than it is of ideology.
Yeah, yeah. I think in the end, our failure in the last 50 years, our failure is been much greater a failure of management. That even within our ideology, I mean, Nehru asked his bureaucrats to give me socialism. What did they give him? They gave him license Raj. Nehru did not want license Raj. If he had realized what he had created, what the bureaucrats had created, and these were very fine people, good minds, but they really were terrible as managers. And that is why I think the one institution that has truly disappointed us in the last 50 years is our bureaucracy. I mean, we bought that cruel myth of the steel frame, and it's haunting us today because the bureaucracy has become a much bigger obstacle to reform and change than even the politicians.
Nehru wrote sort of, you know, in the discovery of India, how sort of his everyday experience with the reality of governance brought with it a certain coarsening of his sensibilities, of his sensitivities in a sense. You know, he was a sort of a sensitive, idealistic man and had a vision, and there was this aspect of this. To what degree do you feel that you know, this whole aspect of, you know, the sort of the thrust, the movement, the energy of globalization perhaps has a coarsening effect on our sensibilities, ambition, competitiveness, things that are held out as virtues in one realm have an opposite effect, impact too in those terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt about it. That on the one hand, I mean, the world is not perfect. That you need that competitiveness to be economically successful, to create jobs, and to create a middle class society. But on the other hand, these very characteristics are characteristics that do coarsen the sensibility. Now, I think we, in a sense, if you think about this onslaught of global culture, this sort of fictitious global culture, and my only sort of sense of consolation is that we survived the Mughals, we survived the British, and I think somehow we're going to survive Coca-Cola. And the reason probably is, again, going back to the elephant, that the hold of tradition, while money is no longer a dirty word, still people are ambivalent about money. You know, when Bill Gates came here, this young Marwadi entrepreneur got up to ask him, now Mr. Gates, you know, you made all this money. When are you going to, what are you going to do with it? And he was talking about that end, but money was not the end. And Bill Gates laughed and he says, you know, only in India have I been asked this question. And I think that it's a luxury in a poor country, Rajiv, in the end, to worry too much about these things. Because if the price of prosperity for the poor is Coca-Cola, I think the poor will any day vote for Coca-Cola. They might even like it. And so I think we should be cautious. And for the last 50 years, we've been trying to prejudge what people want. Our bureaucrats were decided how many brands of lipstick there should be. Now we should leave it to that girl in the village, which brand of lipstick, if not what she wants to use. I mean, there was a time when we had a 250% tax on cosmetics because Pranab Mukherjee felt as a finance minister that Indians should not use cosmetics. They should eat. But that village girl still wanted to use something. So I just feel let's leave it to the people and just kind of let loose, let people kind of get on with it and not try to decide.
Well, I think that while there is sort of almost a consensus that the state has failed to deliver, and the processes and mechanisms of bureaucracy and license Raj, etc., have failed to deliver, but there is the fear that while sort of Coca-Cola may be imminent, drinking water isn't really yet available. In what ways do you think, shall we say, unfettered liberalization might be channeled with greater focus, so that these sort of very fundamental survival issues, in some ways, don't get left behind or don't take too long being resolved?
Yeah, and you know, you've hit upon water. I think probably the biggest issue in the 21st century is going to be water. And societies that manage water are going to be, are able to manage water, are be far more advantaged than those that don't.
And so perhaps we're not going to be able to get away from substantial role, from governments playing a substantial role.
Yeah, and I mean, I nowhere would I ever suggest that you can do away with you need governance. That's in fact our soft underbelly, is governance. So, but I would just say that societies which have found ways to use the entrepreneurial energy to solve problems like water. There are many societies where water is provided by private providers. There are companies in France. France is the country of dirigism. In fact, the water is provided in many communities by private companies.
In what ways would you temper, shall I say, modify or change sort of the global model, the globally accepted model of liberalization being promoted by G7, by well, I was going to say the IMF and the World Bank, but I think the World Bank seems to be sort of stepping back a little and talking about development and spirituality and sort of bringing in a new dialogue. I don't know how serious it is, but at least it is bringing that into the discourse. In what ways would you see that tempered, modified, adapted for our own situation, predicament, culture, lifestyles, attitudes, beliefs? I mean, a whole spectrum of.
Well, I mean, the model I would not tamper with the model. The model, we still have a long way to go to unshackle. We know this is India unbound, but it's being unbound. It's not already there. So we still have the very heavy hand of the state. What we need is to, I think what's going to happen to India, and what the poverty industry does not seem to recognize. We're so mesmerized by the poverty numbers that what we're not looking at are the numbers of the growth of the middle class. What's going to unshackle India is the explosive growth of the middle class. Now, when you're growing, when your power growth rate is 7%, and your population is, for the first time, your population growth rate has begun to slow. This means basically that your per capita growth rate is over 5%. Now, at that rate, what you're doing is you're exploding the middle class. What you're doing is you're pulling people up every day from the poor into the middle class. And even though, today, middle class is only 18% of the population. Now, in successful societies, middle class is the majority. And that's what my view is, that I think it will become the majority. I would just say that let's keep doing this. Where I would say is let's keep fighting for our freedom. And I would just say the middle class, as it becomes bigger, will demand much more accountability from the political class than the poor are able to. And so I feel I would not, investing in education is common sense. It is nothing to do with tempering the reforms. Investing in health is a thing we have to do. It will in fact make us competitive as a nation. So these things all go together. So I don't think there is that dichotomy. The consensus the world is at today, is recognized that education is not a good in itself, not only a matter of compassion to the poor. Education is a matter of competitiveness. And so it's all, it's...
Richard, thank you very much. That's been a great privilege.
Thank you.